I'm on these stairs to talk about a game with stairs. Same name, different game. Castlevania III, Dracula's Curse. That's right, friends, I am at this famous horror movie landmark for this year's Same Name, Different Game Halloween special. Now, since the Nintendo Entertainment Celebration is still going strong, what else could we talk about but Castlevania III? Well, let's get started, as we always do, with a little history. Akumajo Dracula, translated Demon Castle Dracula, was released on the Famicom disk system in 1986. It hit the US the following year as Castlevania. It put the player in the shoes of vampire hunter Simon Belmont, the latest in a long line of vampire hunters and keeper of the legendary whip known as the Vampire Killer. The game was tough as nails, but its nods to classic movie monsters and folklore were unique at the time, and it drew players in a major way. It was ported to a number of computer formats as well as arcade systems, and in short order, a sequel was on the way. In 1987, Dracula II Noroi no Fuin, translated as Dracula II The Accursed Seal, hit the Famicom disk system once again, and once again the following year it hit the NES, released here as Castlevania II Simon's Quest. Simon's Quest varied the formula quite a bit, taking shape as a non-linear exploratory game influenced by games like Nintendo's own Metroid and Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. Simon's Quest was also a big hit, and so it led to yet another sequel. In 1989, Konami released Akumajo Densetsu in Japan for the Famicom. That's translated as Demon Castle Legend. This game is a return to form, the more basic side-scrolling action style of the original Akumajo Dracula. In 1990, it came stateside as Castlevania III, Dracula's Curse. And a lot of things were changed, but before we get to the changes, let's start with the basics. The core gameplay is the same in each game. You play as original Castlevania hero Simon Belmont's ancestor, named Ralph in the Japanese version and Trevor in the US version. For simplicity's sake, I'll be using his American name for the rest of the episode. This game is a relatively straightforward side-scrolling romp, but it does include branching paths in certain parts, allowing you to vary your path to Dracula, making it arguably one of the most replayable action games on the system. Trevor starts his journey alone, but is quickly joined by one of three companions. The first is Grant Dynasty, a thief and acrobat whose family was murdered by Dracula. The second is Sypha Belnades, a female vampire hunter who uses magic, and for some reason was given masculine pronouns in the shoddy English translation. The final companion is Alucard, the half-vampire son of Dracula. Now, Trevor can only have one companion, and once you switch, you're stuck with the current one until you meet another one, so choose carefully, as they each have their pros and cons. We'll start with Grant. Grant is found if you choose to climb the clock tower after stage 1. He's the only character who can change directions mid-jump. He can cling to walls, he's faster than all the other players, and he's the only one whose duck actually keeps him under most enemy projectiles. He does take more damage per hit than Trevor or Alucard, though. We'll talk a little bit more about him when we start getting to differences. Next is Sypha. Sypha is found if you take the upper path after stage 3-2. Sypha is slow and takes the same amount of damage from enemies as Grant. Her default attack is weak and extremely short range, but her spells are very useful. She has fire, ice, and lightning spells. All are useful to some degree, but the lightning spell is extremely powerful, though rare. More on that later. Finally, Alucard. While most folks know him better from Symphony of the Night, this was his debut. He's found in stage 5-5 if you take the lower path after stage 3-2. Alucard is the only character besides Trevor who can get his default attack powered up. It starts as 1 fireball, but can be upgraded to 3. He can also turn into a bat by pressing down and A, though it uses hearts to stay in bat form. Both versions take you on a quest to rid the world of the evil Count Dracula and his minions. The games play exactly the same. A jumps, B attacks, up and B uses sub-weapons and spells, select changes your character. Like Ninja Gaiden 3, both the American and Japanese versions are the same in broad strokes. Also, like Ninja Gaiden 3, the US version is a lot harder. I suspect the reasons for this are similar to Ninja Gaiden 3, and that either the Japanese thought American audiences were more hardcore, or it was a reaction to game rentals, or a combination of the two. So let's dig into these changes. First and foremost, the way damage is dished out was changed. In the Japanese version, each enemy does a set amount of damage, and every time you meet that enemy, no matter what stage you're on, it does that amount of damage. For example, if you're playing as Grant and you get hit by a skeleton in stage 3, you'll take 4 points of damage. And if you get hit by a skeleton in the final stage, you'll take 4 points of damage. The US version, however, bases damage on how far into the game you are. All of the enemies on a given stage do the same amount of damage, and it increases as you get further. It starts low in the first 3 stages, then goes up in the second 3, and is maxed out in the final 3. So in this example, we'll say you're playing as Trevor. You get hit by a skeleton in stage 1, you take 2 points of damage. Now, if you're on the final stage and you get hit by a skeleton, you take twice as much damage from the same enemy. For these examples, keep in mind that in both versions, Grant takes 1 more point of damage on any hit than Trevor does. Now, the net effect of all this should be that the early stages are easier on the NES than in the Famicom version, and the later stages are harder. But in practice, that simply isn't the case. The early stages are relatively easy no matter what, and the biggest hazards are the pitfalls. So all it ends up doing is making the final 3 stages, which are already incredibly difficult, even harder. It also negates a lot of the original design choices. By adding new enemies and placing them in the later stages, mixing them with the earlier enemies, the designers created a much more natural difficulty curve in Akumajou Densetsu. This is wiped away in Castlevania III in favor of a much more rigid difficulty curve. I will say though, that while the Castlevania III approach makes the later stages harder, it has the odd side effect of canceling out Grant and Sypha's weaker defenses. Once you hit stage 7, Trevor and Alucard will take 4 points of damage on every hit. Grant and Sypha will take 5, but you have 16 units of health, so any of them will die in 4 hits. And speaking of support characters, let's talk about some differences there. Grant is the only one of the companion characters to get changed. Let's start with his boss form. In order to get Grant to join you, you have to defeat him in monster form at the top of the clock tower. Oddly, the US version seems easier. In the Japanese version, after taking a hit or two, he'll start climbing on the ceiling like he does when you use him, and he'll rain axes and knives down on you. In the US version, he just runs straight at you, at least from what I've seen. When he's on your side, there is a major change. In the Japanese version, this is his attack. In the US version, this is his attack. Yeah. In Akumajou Densetsu, his default attack is throwing daggers, not just stabbing with a dagger. And it doesn't cost you any hearts. And he can even still toss them from walls, the same way he does in Castlevania III when he's got the dagger sub-weapon. But again, it still doesn't cost him any hearts. Because of this, Grant only has access to 2 sub-weapons in the Famicom cart, the axe and the stopwatch. This means that Grant equipped with the axe has 2 useful attack options, though in the Japanese version he cannot throw the axe while hanging on a wall or ceiling, but it's a small price to pay. Some might say that this makes Grant overpowered and therefore it's reasonable that he was nerfed for the US version, and I might agree with that if the game wasn't so hard even in its easier Japanese iteration. The net effect of these changes is that Grant goes from being the easy choice to take with you in Akumajo Densetsu to being arguably the least desirable companion in Castlevania III. Now let's talk more about sub-weapons. The game contains a total of 8 sub-weapons. All characters can collect the stopwatch. It's the only sub-weapon that all 4 characters can use in every version. It also costs too many hearts and is basically useless in all but a few specific situations. In addition to that, there are the dagger and the axe, which both Trevor and Grant can use. Trevor alone has access to the cross and the holy water. Sypha alone has access to her 3 spells of fire, ice, and lightning. Alucard has no sub-weapons besides the stopwatch, but again, his bat ability does use hearts. Naturally, some of these items are more useful than others, so naturally in the NES version they changed a bunch of the drops from the Famicom. All of the weapons have analogs, so for example, if a torch would drop a cross for Trevor, it will drop a lightning spell for Sypha and an axe for Grant. So if we take a look here in stage 4, we see in the Famicom version, this torch has a lightning spell for Sypha. In the NES version, fire magic. The same thing happens in stage 6. Right before the boss, this torch has a cross in the Famicom version. In the NES, a big heart. Not even a weapon, a big heart. While we're talking about stage 6, this is one of the many appearances of the Ghastly Grim and Ancient Raven. People talk about the birds from Ninja Gaiden and the Medusa heads from Castlevania, but they never talk about the birds from Castlevania. These things move erratically and are quite possibly my biggest source of frustration in the game. Yes, more than the Medusa heads. Many times when playing to get footage for this episode, "Prophet," said I. "Thing of evil. Prophet still if bird or devil. Get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore." Alright, now that I've got that out of my system, let's talk about the end of the game. The final path to Dracula is not an easy one no matter what, but in the US version, the difficulty is ratcheted up considerably. Most immediately noticeable is that the place where you restart after losing a life is changed. I didn't notice any other changes to these points anywhere else in the game, so they picked the worst possible place to do it just once. In Akumajo Densetsu, when you die, you start at the bottom of the stairs, right outside Drac's chamber. In Castlevania III, you start several rooms back, and this wouldn't be the worst thing in the world except for this other change. The last room before you get to the stairs requires you to jump across a few pendulums. In the Famicom version, this is not a problem, as there are no enemies in this room. But in the NES version, I guess they wanted to spice it up a bit, so they added a never-ending stream of bats. The bats spawn semi-randomly, and they don't stop coming, so this can be a big problem here. The next thing changed about Dracula is that they did the weapon switch again. Right before Drac, there's a candle with a weapon in it. In the Japanese version, it's a cross, which would be lightning magic for Sypha. In the American version, it's a dagger, which is fire magic for Sypha. This effectively sidelines Sypha for the entire fight, and the dagger is the worst, worst sub-weapon Trevor can have. Fortunately, there's an axe in the room you start in the US game, which is better, but still not as good for this fight as the cross. Another change to him goes back to the damage thing. In Akumajo Densetsu, the pillars of fire his first form bring up from the floor only do 2 damage to Trevor. But in Dracula's Curse, just like everything else in the final stage, they do 4. Once again, that's twice as much damage. The last change for the old Count is his third and final form. Now, in both versions, he becomes this giant monster that shoots lasers from his eyes and fingers. In the Japanese version, they're short, and he only fires them in downward trajectories. In the US release, they are considerably longer, which makes them harder to dodge, and he can fire them in upwards angles as well. It's a hard fight that gets unnecessarily harder for American players. But enough about the difficulty. Let's get into the graphics and the sound. Unlike Ninja Gaiden 3, there are graphical and audio changes here. Some enemy sprites are changed. The Flea Man North American audiences are so familiar with becomes this weird gremlin thing, more like what you see in Castlevania IV. The zombie sprite is also changed a bit. In terms of backgrounds, the cross at the very beginning is different, and some of the statues in the back are changed to be less naked. Musically, it's a huge difference. Konami loved to use custom chips in their Famicom games. Life Force and Contra had chips like these, and as a result, the graphics of the Famicom versions are more animated than the NES games. Akumaju Densetsu's graphics aren't improved, but it contains a special coprocessor called the VRC6 chip that allowed for 3 extra sound channels to be used. Now, because of the pinout difference between NES and Famicom cartridges, this was not available on the NES. But this chip makes the music much more complex, and in my opinion, better. But this soundtrack is jams either way. But here, take a listen, judge for yourself. Alright, we're almost done, but there's just a couple more things I need to mention. The NES version, likely because of the increased difficulty, adds a couple of secret codes to help ease things up. First is the notorious Help Me code. If you input your name as Help Me, you'll get 10 lives instead of the standard 3. There are other codes that will also allow you to start with any companion character and even take on a harder version of the game, though God only knows why anyone would want to do that. None of these codes, including the increased difficulty one, work in the Famicom version. And that makes it time to give the edge. Look, this game is a classic, whichever way you choose to play it, but for me, it's a no-brainer. The Famicom version is still a stiff challenge, but feels just slightly more fair. While the soundtrack in both versions is full of jams, I also like the more robust version found in Akumaju Densetsu. Both versions are pretty pricey in the secondary market, but each is available on its given region's virtual console service for both the Wii and the Wii U. So that's it. Thanks for joining me at this classic horror movie locale. And speaking of movies, come back next month as we finish the Nintendo Entertainment Celebration with 2 completely different games from both sides of the Pacific, based on a film series that has a new installment coming out very soon. We'll see you then. Have a safe and happy Halloween.